consider the two following scenarios, right? We have scenario, I don't know how to spell scenario, whatever, we just won't even write the word scenario. So we are still talking about that moral theory called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. And now we're going to talk about the way that utilitarians try to justify punishment. Because there's a big problem, it turns out, for them in justifying punishment. We'll get to that in a sec, but first let's remind ourselves what that theory is and the component theories that we had talked about that make up utilitarianism, right? So utilitarianism itself is, we said, well, the following. Utilitarianism is the theory that we are morally required to do whatever produces the greatest total of pleasure minus pain. And we said before that utilitarianism was made up of or composed out of three sub-theses. The first one that we talked about before was hedonism. Hedonism is the view that what's good for an individual as an end is pleasure, and what's bad for an individual as an end is pain. That's the component theory, which is not itself a moral theory. That's the component theory that tells us that, pleasure and pain are the things that matter. And then the second component was aggregation. Here is exactly how we defined aggregation earlier in the course. Aggregation is the theory that an outcome is better if the sum of what is good for each person minus what is bad for each person is greater. Hedonism told us what's good for individual people, and aggregation tells us how to go from what's good for individual people to what's good for a whole outcome. And the answer that aggregation gives is you add. You find the sum. It's addition that matters when deciding how good a whole situation or a whole outcome is for a whole group of people. And then the third component of utilitarianism we discussed was consequentialism, which is just the view that we are morally required to do whatever will produce the best outcome. And hedonism and aggregation are parts of the answer, or they're the whole answer even, to what a good outcome is, what makes an outcome good. All right, so today we are talking about a problem that utilitarianism seems to face because utilitarianism is founded on aggregation. So this is really a lecture or a discussion or a reading. This reading from Bentham is really about aggregation. Let's talk a little bit about math so that we can see what this problem is. Here's the first thing about addition. The sum of some quantities doesn't care how those quantities are distributed. 1 plus 3 equals 4. The sum that you get when you add these two numbers together is 4. That's the sum. But also, that's the same sum that you get if you add 2 plus 2. So the sum stays the same no matter how the quantities are distributed. Are they distributed evenly? Or are they distributed in some lopsided way, right? Or even an even more lopsided way would be 0 plus 4, right? This is really lopsided. All of the quantity is over here in the 4, but you get the same sum as if it's 1 plus 3 or 2 plus 2. So addition doesn't care about distribution. That's a good slogan. I wasn't even planning on writing that down, but I'll write it down. Addition doesn't care about distribution. And, well, aggregation is just the addition theory of how good a whole outcome is. It just says, you want to figure out how good this situation is, take how good it is for each person and add that all up. It's the addition theory, aggregation. Well, this is going to yield some problems. Okay, so to see the problem, consider these two scenarios. We've got scenario number 1 and scenario number 2, right? Now, in each of these scenarios, we have two people who behave in certain ways, right? So Alice is evil. Alice behaves in evil ways in both scenarios. Alice is evil. Okay? And then we have Bob. Bob is in both scenarios, and Bob is good. Bob does good, kind, generous things. And Alice does selfish, malicious, harmful things. Okay, the two scenarios are identical so far. Well, in scenario one, Alice, is imprisoned because she's evil, right? And Bob, gets a big payday. He gets some money. That's nice. Okay, that's good for him. Makes him happy. And the fact that Alice is imprisoned, that's bad for Alice. But in scenario two, it's switched, where Alice gets the money and Bob is imprisoned. He hasn't done anything wrong, but he's the one who gets sent to prison. Well, according to aggregation, all else being equal, these two scenarios are equally good. Because you have the same total. If money gives Alice and Bob, a +5 goodness points, or happiness points if we like, we get +5 for Alice in this scenario and +5 for Bob in this scenario, and being imprisoned is like a -5 for each of them. Well, then the total is the same in both cases. The total is 0. In both cases, the sum is 0. So aggregation says that these two scenarios are equally good. But you might think they're not equally good. Distribution matters. It matters who gets the good stuff and who gets the bad stuff. There's something other than the sum that matters to whether a scenario is good or bad. This is a problem, or a seeming problem, or an apparent problem for aggregation. And so, as a result, it's going to be an apparent problem for utilitarianism. This is fundamentally a problem about punishment. It seems like, on the surface, at first glance, it seems like because utilitarianism consists partly of aggregation, utilitarianism isn't going to get us the right account of when people should be punished. Because we might think that it matters who gets punished, but if utilitarianism is made up of partly of aggregation, then it seems like utilitarianism is going to get the result that it doesn't matter who gets punished, as long as the total is the highest possible total at the end of the day. So what we're going to discuss today, and what we read in the reading by Jeremy Bentham, who is a defender of utilitarianism, is we're going to get the utilitarian theory of punishment. And we're going to see how the utilitarian theory of punishment attempts to get the right results. It attempts to overcome this problem and say that the right people should be punished and the right people should be rewarded. That is, we're going to see, hopefully for the utilitarian, that actually this is only an apparent problem and that utilitarianism really does punish the people that should be punished and reward the people that should be rewarded. Okay, well, what is the utilitarian theory of punishment? Well, it's something like this. Punishment is always, in and of itself, bad. Because punishment, sort of by definition, makes the person who's being punished unhappy. It causes pain in them in one way or another, whether it's physical pain or emotional or psychological pain, right? So punishment is always going to increase the amount of pain. The only way, according to utilitarianism, that punishment can be morally permissible, that it can be morally permissible for our society to enshrine punishment by punishing criminals or whatever, right? Or the only way that it can be morally justified for an individual person to punish another person by ostracizing them or grounding them or fining them or whatever, right? The only way it can be permissible to punish someone is if the benefit of causing that harm, causing that pain, outweighs the cost. That is, if punishment actually prevents more pain than it causes. Okay, so we can imagine how this could be the case. It could be, for example, that someone commits some crime, and we punish them, we lock them away. But by locking them away, it causes them pain, right? So locking them away causes -5, happiness points to accrue or whatever. But because they're locked away, they can't hurt any others. And so over time, that avoids, another -50, happiness points, right, or sadness points that would accrue to the other future potential victims, right? In that case, locking someone away would be not only justified according to utilitarianism, but required. You'd have to do it because that's the way to maximize the total of pleasure minus pain. And similarly for deterrence effects, right? So if punishing someone publicly, maybe not locking them away, but maybe hanging them or something like that, if doing so publicly or having a public trial and then locking them away, it might cause that individual person -5 pain points, but it avoids all of that pain that would result from other people committing crimes, and because they're now deterred from doing so. They're now afraid to do so because they don't want to be punished in that way. So you can see how punishment can be justified on utilitarian grounds. Here are two of the features of this way of thinking about punishment, thinking about it in the utilitarian way where you only do it if the pleasure that results or the pain that's avoided is greater than the pain that is caused by punishing. Here's the first feature, and these features are advantages, of course. This way of thinking about punishment, the utilitarian way that Bentham outlined in the reading for today, is humane. It's not vengeful. It factors in the pain of the criminal. You can sometimes get the sense that the justice system is about vengeance and that it's cruel. It seems to take a kind of bizarre pleasure in punishing individuals. Oh, by the way, the pleasure that could result from causing pain in someone else, that might be a problem for utilitarianism also. We'll come back to that in another meeting of the class. Anyway, it seems like it's an advantage of the utilitarian theory of punishment that it cares about, it factors in, right, the fact that the punishment is going to be unpleasant for the criminal and that that's a bad thing. It treats the criminal as a human. It's humane in that sense. That's one feature. And then the second feature, and this is also supposed to be a virtue of the utilitarian theory of punishment that we read for today, is the following. It gets a lot of the intuitive, plausible results. That is, if you have an opinion already about who should be punished and when, you probably have that opinion not because you were following utilitarianism, not because you were weighing, what's going to produce the greatest total of pleasure minus pain. But it turns out that if you do make that calculation when deciding who to punish and when, you're actually going to get a lot of the same results that we already seem to think are just. So let's run through a few of them. Bentham points out that the utilitarian theory of punishment is going to get the result that there is no ex post facto punishment. Ex post facto punishment is punishment that happens post or after the fact. So if there's some behavior that is allowed, there's no rule against it, and then we decide there should be a rule against it, and so we create a rule prohibiting that behavior. It seems totally unfair to then go back, find the people who exhibited that behavior or who acted in this now impermissible way in the past, before there was a rule against it, and punish those people. That seems totally the wrong thing to do. Well, utilitarianism, according to Bentham, actually gets that same result, because there's no point in punishing people for behavior that wasn't at the time prohibited, because that's not going to deter any future rule violation. It's not like people are going to be able to guess what the rules are going to be in the future and hold back from violating them and thereby produce more pleasure or avoid more pain. So utilitarianism is going to get this same result. You shouldn't punish people for things that weren't prohibited at the time. Here's another result that it gets. Don't punish children or the insane. This is something that we might think is just. Well, utilitarianism, surprisingly, gets this result also because, well, of the same thing about deterrence. Children and certain people with certain mental ailments, they can't control their behavior in the appropriate way. So if you punish them for doing this sort of thing, it's not going to deter other children from doing it because those children or those insane people don't have the capacity or the capability to respond to the threat of punishment. So utilitarianism gets this result. There's going to be no deterrence effect by punishing those people who do commit the crimes, and so you shouldn't punish them. Here's another sort of intuitive, plausible result that the utilitarian theory of punishment gets. Don't disproportionately punish. That is, if you're a utilitarian, you're doing this weighing job where you're trying to produce the minimum amount of pain in the criminal in order to produce the maximum beneficial result. And you might think that a disproportionate punishment is just a punishment that causes too much pain in the person who's being punished. And so utilitarianism straightforwardly gets the result that you shouldn't, way overly severely punish some very minimal crime. And that's the right result. Here's another intuitive or plausible result that the utilitarian argument for punishment or system of punishment gets. Rehabilitate when possible. That is, when you can avoid merely locking someone away, but you can instead rehabilitate them. That is, give them certain habits of future behavior, beneficial habits like not harming others in the future, right? Not committing these crimes in the future. If you can do that, you should do it. If it's possible, you should do it. We might think this is the right way to think about punishment. And utilitarianism gets this result because, well, rehabilitation, if you can pull it off, is going to prevent future pain more than merely inflicting pain on someone who's committed a crime. Here's a final intuitive or plausible result that the utilitarian theory of punishment gets. Don't punish deviant sexual acts. This one might seem very plausible to a lot of, philosophers thinking today, but this was a very, very, very radical idea when Bentham himself was writing. The idea here is just that there are certain types of sexual behavior that deviate from the norm. I have most principally in mind, homosexual sex. For most of human history, in most places, this sort of behavior was thought to be punishable. It was thought to be something that we should definitely and very severely punish people for. But now, a lot of people at least think you shouldn't punish people for this. You shouldn't imprison someone for having gay sex, for example. Well, utilitarianism gets this result. That is, deviant sexual acts, as long as they're consensual, of course, these sexual acts, they don't cause any pain. Indeed, they cause pleasure. And so they're not the kind of thing that you need to discourage. They're not the kind of thing that you need to prevent the same person from doing again in the future. So they're just not the kind of thing that you should inflict pain in order to prevent, because they're not the kinds of thing that you should prevent at all. So utilitarianism gets the result that you shouldn't punish homosexuality. And in fact, we're going to read a longer piece, or at least parts of a longer piece by Bentham, very specifically about this topic. And Bentham is way ahead of his time. What we're going to read in this class, I think we're going to read it next, is what is by many accounts, as far as we can tell, the very first written argument in the English language that gay sex should not be criminal. The very first time that someone argued this in the English language in writing. We're going to read that, and it's Bentham's. Bentham gets some credit for that, you might think. Okay, There's one last thing that I want to emphasize about the utilitarian theory of punishment. It gets all of these intuitive results, but it gets them by a very different route, or by a very different mechanism of justification than we normally arrive at these results. So let's just go through each one really, really quickly. No ex post facto punishment. Why can't you punish someone for something that wasn't prohibited at the time? Normally we think it's because it's unfair. But utilitarianism doesn't really care about fairness in that sense. The reason that utilitarianism gets this result is just that it won't discourage people from doing this pain-inducing thing in the future. So a different justification, right? A different route for arriving at this result. Moving on to the next one. Don't punish children or the insane. Again, here, normally we think you shouldn't punish children or the insane because they can't control their actions and they can't be held truly responsible. They don't deserve to be punished. But for the utilitarian, the whole notion of desert doesn't enter into it. The idea is just that you won't be able to, consistently discourage children or the insane from exhibiting this behavior in the future, and so that's why you shouldn't punish them. So a different route to arrive at this same result. Moving on to the third one, don't disproportionately punish. Again, here, the normal justification for this is that disproportionate punishment is unfair or unjust. Utilitarianism doesn't think in those terms, or doesn't understand those terms in the same way. The idea here is just that, it causes some unnecessary pain somewhere in the equation. That's all that utilitarianism cares about, and that's all that it uses to get to this result, a very different way of justifying this claim, or a very different way of getting to this result. Okay, the fourth one, rehabilitate when possible. Well, this one actually, it's not clear how we normally get to this result. We just sort of might like the idea of rehabilitation. We might think that it's helping another person. This is sort of the way that utilitarianism arrives at this result, because utilitarianism just thinks that, it's better to, prevent future pain if you can get this person to not commit the crime in the future. Fine, so in this case, maybe utilitarianism kind of does match up with the normal justification that we give for rehabilitation. And then the final one, don't punish deviant sexual acts. Well, I kind of think that outside of utilitarianism, at least historically, there isn't really any justification for this because this isn't the dominant view. The dominant view, historically, is that we should punish deviant sexual acts. So, utilitarianism gets a different result and therefore, of course, has a different justification for the result that it gets.